Hello, it is me, the YouTuber. Thank you for clicking and subscribing. You know, we often talk about video games in this establishment, and let me tell you, that's a lot of hard work. Having to think about such a complex and tremendously artistic art form really takes it out of you. And sometimes you just need to take a break, let your brain rest from all that deep thinking. That's why we decided to just do something less intellectual, engage with a far inferior medium, and watch the 1988 animated feature film Oliver and Company. Eller Oliver och gänget som vi kallar det I Sverige! When people talk about this film, they usually only focus on it being a half-baked transitional Disney romp that has aged like mostly anything from the 80s. They might muse about how it went up against The Land Before Time and unceremoniously got critically crushed in comparison, or maybe they'll just proclaim how unremarkable it truly is based on how barely anyone remembers anything about it, except for the villain's gruesome end and the singing garbage dog. And these judgments do make sense to some extent. While it did not necessarily perform absolutely terrible, it is still considered the last in a long unfortunate string of animated movies for the Disney company. Having been preceded by a decade of delays and poor showings, the legacy this movie rode on was family-friendly depictions of child abuse, the odd adaptation of a book about murdering foxes, The Black Cauldron, and, well, The Great Mouse Detective is actually the best film Disney ever made, but the point we're trying to make here is that Oliver and Company feels so firmly connected to this previous mess when compared to the succeeding Little Mermaid and the 90s Renaissance that it's downright jarring. Honestly, a lot of Oliver and Company's reputation is likely an effect of being this harsh zeitgeist spectacle right before an era of well-received glossy fairy tales. I mean, it is kind of a dire situation when all the big shot movie reviewer Roger Ebert could muster in his middling recommendation was this.
It was harmless, it was inoffensive, there were some moments that were funny. I liked the little Mexican chihuahua.
The chihuahuas, they should make the film.
The animation looked good. I don't know.
With all that said though, it's honestly severely uninteresting to us to come to the conclusion that Oliver and Company failed for not being Disney enough. That it's a bad film that really sucks as an adaptation for not being faithful to its source material, or something along those lines. That's basically the kind of surface level value judgments anyone could come to while half asleep during a first viewing. So, after recently having rewatched it on the Hell Service on Demand Disney+, we'd instead like to go another route and put this animated kids movie under more scrutiny than perhaps most people would find necessary, and analyze what it truly has to say.
Holy shit!
And well, while we're not gonna harbor any pretense of this video being a profound view on the film in question, we think it goes surprisingly deep in how shallow it actually is. But more importantly, the morals of Oliver and Company are horrible. For anyone unfamiliar with this so-called Disney masterpiece, let us give you a rundown of what the hell this movie is all about. Oliver and Company is a loose adaptation of the 19th century literary work Oliver Twist, and we mean loose. A few character names, themes, and various plot points carry over in some shape or form, but for the most part, it is not really representative of the beloved original by Charles Dickens. It kind of just vaguely gestures in that direction. Perhaps the most notable difference is how the Disneyfied version is an 80s contemporary fable set in New York City, instead of London in the 1800s. And the setting becomes especially relevant in how much more connected the movie is to real-world issues of today, and how unmistakable these struggles in fact are. The story has a kind of rags to riches framework where one would be justified in believing that everyone involved would be rewarded in some way by the end, But instead the movie disregards most of the riches and just keeps the rags. As a kids' film that's plausibly made to teach some kind of valuable moral or life lesson, that's a bit strange, especially when we start to really think about it. So let's do that. Establishing shot, New York City. A box of 8 kittens is placed on the sidewalk of Fifth Avenue for $5 apiece, with one being left behind unwanted for whatever reason, in a scene that somehow manages to always make me cry on command. In these new homeless conditions, this cat baby and the viewer is introduced to the main players of the narrative. Firstly, a ragtag gang of ruffian dogs. They include the hip and cool Dodger, the comic relief stereotype Chihuahua Tito, the sophisticated Francis, the girl one Rita, and the big dog Einstein. We think his thing is that he's the dumb one, but they're also all dogs, so we're not sure that entirely follows. If anything else, he's the most dog, I suppose. Together they live under poor conditions in a decrepit houseboat with their greatly indebted owner Fagin, who's so deep down on his luck that he's eating dog food for survival. The movie really wants to hammer home how abysmal his conditions are, with him owing some amount of money to the absolute unit Mr. Sykes, who's basically gonna murder Fagin if he doesn't deliver. You know, just gonna casually kill him all the way to death. He's fucked. These circumstances dance on this awkward edge between exaggeratedly comical and anxiously depressing, with Fagin being a harmless, wacky cartoon character functioning under his own light-hearted physics, while a gruesome mobster is out to get him. It's certainly a downplaying of what is actually a surprisingly dark situation for a kids' film, with the dog's stifled understanding of the human world reducing great urgency into a minor inconvenience. Which is to be expected from a Disney film, perhaps even intending the dog perspective to run counter with the child audience, who might not even grasp the full situation, even though it's all there in the text. Concepts like debt and personal bankruptcy are not ones we expect kids to comprehend, so while the human issues of the film all revolve around money and ownership, the animal-centric conflict of the story is rather that of home and belonging. For the dogs on the houseboat, the threat isn't that Sykes is definitely going to bludgeon Fagin to death, but rather that their little home is being put in jeopardy. That is to say, both parties' problems are summed up by the need for money, but their outlook on why they need that money are wildly different. Which again brings us back to the main character of the little kitten, who following this hunt for money, accidentally ends up with the girl Jenny, who adopts the cat and names him Oliver. The circumstances for these two parties in particular to meet is not coincidental though, as Jenny is specifically targeted for her wealth not once, not twice, but thrice within the film. Being the daughter of rich, absent parents, the matchup with Oliver is awkwardly befitting as both search for companionship or belonging rather than monetary gains. This is key for the messaging of Oliver and Company, where the value of home is put on a much greater pedestal than that of riches. But it's also fatally tone deaf in the extreme vessels that are used to portray this. Within a day, Oliver goes from homelessness to living in a fancy rich house, and in his own limited worldview, he values his place in the wealthy home over the rundown boat simply because this girl, Jenny, needs his company. His Oliver and Company, if you will. For Oliver, all problems have been solved by this point. He's living comfortably with a commendable life calling of being the friend his equally lonely kid needs, being the Sonic to our Chris Thorndike. It feels like there is a setup here for a point to be made later on about choosing belonging over wealth. But that never happens. Money is just presented as something petty and short-sighted that evil people extort other people for. It has no room for more nuance than that. Which I guess would be fine in a movie where all characters have acceptable living conditions, but that's certainly not this one. Now, obviously the movie isn't over here. There's still a core conflict to be resolved, what with Fagin having a certified serial killer on his neck, or the houseboat being threatened by the meanie Dobermans, depending on your viewpoint. We need a happy ending. Oliver might be rich and content, but his friends live in miserable poverty. So, put a pin in that. We'll get back to it. Following this far resolution, the titular company, thinking the titular Oliver got kidnapped, decides to counter-kidnap him back to the houseboat. Not surprisingly, there's a lot of dismay as he's yanked from the house with the Chagall and Matisse paintings, and returned to this shabby den of canine misfits, with the expected interpretation by cool and hip Dodger that Oliver cared more about the glamorous high life than his friends. But we know that Oliver doesn't care about that. He doesn't want the capital company. He wants to be the company. Going deep here. There's a clear highlighting of belonging in this scene, where Oliver is pressed on if he would actually take the opportunity of shoving the others in front of the bus. And considering he's a literal baby who only knew these guys for one evening, yeah, he'd probably be a bit justified in not putting much stock on his role in their gang of misfits. But of course, Oliver is pure-hearted and still deeply cares about the Paw Patrol, so this creates deep internal conflict for him. But know that it's not about the money and living conditions. It's always about the idea of home, family, the house. Oliver could live in both places, but love made one of them home. Meanwhile, he's not taking one for the team and being all in it together if he doesn't try to get them naughty bad boy doggos who want to shut down the boat orphanage or something. Whatever outlook this eponymous main character has about the core conflict is non-important, however, as Fagin pops into the scene and reminds us that this is all actually about him, definitely getting mutilated in a warehouse by Mr. Sykes tomorrow. A real downer moment, you might say. But finding out Oliver has a fancy name collar gives him hope of surviving. Fagin promptly transforms the cat into a MacGuffin and reduces his spoken lines for the rest of the film to barely none. And he uses this great opportunity of having found this rich person's pet to collect a finder's reward and solve his monetary problems. Jenny, being absolutely loaded, responds with an "Oi, sure mate in it, I'll throw in another £1,000,000, you dig?" With Fagin buying a yacht for all ownerless dogs to cruise the Caribbean while Sykes is thrown into jail for doing a bad extortion. Nah, he writes a ransom note instead. What did you expect? Fagin is not clever. He's presumably abysmal with handling money, but his main flaw is being overly compassionate. This is why he cares for 5 dogs while not being able to feed himself. A lot of people have trouble taking care of 1 dog, and they have an income. It's also why this plan on doing a hostage situation with Oliver absolutely does not work. He's too much of a nice guy to take this child's piggy bank even if it might possibly help him. Fagin is truly a scoundrel with a heart of gold. In this scene, he goes through the deepest turmoil and greatest personal growth of any character in the entire movie, practically sacrificing his own life for the happiness of a child. Now, what happens is that Sykes kidnaps Jenny to do a real proper ransom bid instead, breaking even with Fagin. So, the outcome is unfortunate. But reading intent and applying basic narrative structure, it's hard not to feel like Fagin should be the actual protagonist of the story, being the true underdog living with the full consequences and misery of homelessness, but not losing his moral ground even when he's hit absolute rock bottom. That's what the ironing board visualizes. Sure, it's a romanticized view of homelessness that proposes a reward for going through the proper struggle. But that's also kinda what a Disney movie is. A modern fairy tale for telling life morals to kids. But this isn't Fagin and Company, it's Oliver and Company. Look, he's right there! So the film continues with the cinematic action sequence of the gang breaking into Shinra headquarters to retrieve Arif and escape Midgar, attributing the final meaningful heroic deed to Oliver, who somehow manages to hold off human form Ratigan despite being a freaking baby. But we're not judging his ability. Cats are pretty cool, all things considered. With Mr. Sykes run over by a train and blown up, the main conflict of the film is resolved. The meanie poo-poo Dobermans have been electrocuted to death, Fagin is no longer in debt, and Oliver can return to his new fancy home. There, Jenny celebrates her birthday with the company, before they part ways. Everyone happy with smiles on their faces, as they sing and dance. Roll credits. But what the hell is this ending? Where does it put us? What is the actual resolution? Of course, Oliver gets all he ever wanted, truly living happily ever after. And the movie's named after him, so that follows. But what about everyone else? From where we put our pin earlier in this video, the only thing that has changed is that Fagin has one less homicidal maniac breathing down his neck, which, fine, is absolutely a plus and a great stress relief. But really, that's it? This homeless guy who's been wearing the same clothes for God knows how long, likely hasn't showered in a year and doesn't even get the benefit of a shave, is invited to this wealthy girl's birthday party after saving her life. Hangs out with the butler and has an overall good time. Then he just leaves and goes back to a life of misery. He's even shown to start betting with money he doesn't have immediately after he's out of debt. This is the point where the vessels of extremes used to portray the idea of home and belonging straight up breaks the movie. Jenny could just as well have been a middle-class kid with the butler as her single father, and nothing would have really changed, except for this irking inaction on the rich family's part. And the spoiled poodle, I guess. There are numerous sets of resolutions to fix the gang's situation that could fit in easily here. Anything from a straight reward for saving Jenny from a freaking child kidnapper, or having something of intense value from the home get in their hands, to perhaps the most poetically satisfying conclusion, where they rediscover the piggy bank at the docks to find it actually contained vast riches, because Jenny is wealthy and has no concept of money anyway. But again, Fagin isn't rewarded this from his self-sacrifice. He gets his debt written off and that's it. Like, there's an assumption that anyone with net zero can pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get to the top with hard work and elbow grease. The absolutely crushing class divide under capitalism wasn't the true terror all along. It was just this big bad extortion man who did a naughty. To be fair, that's exactly the sort of messaging you'd expect from aspiring monopoly, the Walt Disney Company. In fact, this outright silly, bordering on offensive representation of poverty and monetary distress is an overarching theme of not only the movie, but the supplementary material as well. Like this book for literal toddlers, for example, which after Sykes is drowned to death, ends with the following words.
Now that the mean Sykes was gone forever, Fagin no longer had any concerns. Now we never have to steal anything ever again, he said happily.
And ain't that just the biggest load of shit you've ever heard? Like, yeah, we get it. This is clearly a story for babies. But that doesn't mean that we have to be baby-brained about it ourselves. And again, this goes back to the animal perspective of the story, where the core conflict was if they'd be able to keep living on their houseboat or not, with it acting as a better alternative than living on the streets. Sure, a dog might not mind living in filth and eating stolen sausages, but that's also because they're dogs. Fagin is just some guy who got deep into the shit, and is now just expected to get out of it. In fact, no other animal than Oliver gets to move in with the rich family in the end, perhaps because there is this subtle suggestion that he's the only one who truly deserves it in his disregard for money, valuing Jenny over wealth. Which is actually even more fucked up if you think about it, because of course the poor characters would be the most concerned about money. What reason do we have to suspect Disney to have simply forgotten that the poor characters remain poor in the end? Could there instead be a sincere belief that they actually somehow belong on the streets? That they're free spirits, they cannot be contained by something like a house? They own these streets of gold. Apparently they got the crown, despite not actually owning anything. The songs portraying the street perspective of this film are really revealing in that sense. For example, the opening song Once Upon a Time in New York City is about the place being one of opportunities, where something is always happening. It's the American dream. It directly calls out to Oliver to reassure him that even though things look grim, his time will come. There is a place that has been made for him in this town. He just hasn't found it yet. All of the songs seem to carry this expectation that good will come for the ones who can not just wait, but survive and persevere in grim conditions. But that's a horrible life lesson, which is presented in such a harsh way in the song Streets of Gold that you can't help but be baffled by the audacity of it. You're gonna see how the best survive. We make an art of staying alive. If you do just as you're told, these are streets of gold. This song is really just straight up saying that life on the street is abysmal and that the struggle there is the day-to-day battle for staying alive. But if you can manage this, everything will be fine because you've accomplished the honorable elusive goal of not dying. To say that this is a low bar to uphold is one thing, but to also present it as something admirable in a film that additionally wants to portray the passive rich family as equal to these characters is pretty nasty stuff. It really establishes an idea of the natural order in this world, where the rich and poor have their irrefutable set places. The poor dog will be occupied with getting food, while the rich dog is free to pursue self-actualization, like personal beauty or making a small chihuahua into a sailor man. It's what they sing about. That's what occupies their worldview, but there is never any shift in this dynamic, so we are led to presume that this is what signifies their very essence. Like Dodger sings his famous self-confident song about being street smart and thriving in this vagabond life. It's the one thing everyone remembers about the movie, but it's seldom mentioned that it's a facade. It's his character flaw. He isn't independent. He doesn't have street savoir-faire. He needs Oliver's help to get the hot dogs, and then he goes home and tells tall tales about his achievements. It's the kind of lie you would expect a kids' film to address in some way, but Dodger remains as the self-proclaimed leader of his pack through nothing but his word on the matter. The one street smart he has was to convince his friends that he has them. And in many ways, it would seem too awkward for Oliver and company to properly handle this entire issue, because that mandates that the narrative of the happy voluntary drifter is revealed as untrue. That not even the most fit can survive the streets, and worse, that they are deluding themselves that they do have what it takes. I think we can all agree that Disney wouldn't have the guts to not just be honest about the nature of homelessness and poverty in a film like this, but also in presenting the idea that it's something unsustainable that has to be mitigated post-haste and can't be superficially solved. The original Oliver Twist story was noteworthy at its time for its uncompromisingly real depictions of the lower class, breaking from romantic ideas of this life as profoundly simple and worry-free. It's the kind of story that needs its full context to not make character motivation seem odd when simplified, and a sensible tone and messaging to show that, yes, homelessness and poverty exists in our world today. The real conclusion lives within you and, more importantly, the systems that maintain these injustices. And at this point, you kind of have to ask yourself, why set this adaptation in modern times if not to modernize it, to tackle the same issues in a way that would be more relevant today? It doesn't feel like they were really committed to anything more complex than Oliver Twist but with dogs. Like someone blurted that idea out during a pitch meeting and they just went with it. Which is exactly what happened, but that's besides the point. Just because it's a story for children doesn't mean that they couldn't tackle these issues with more nuance, because while being baby-brained, kids are still clever and could probably wrestle with deeper stuff than this. We're not saying that they should have gone in gruesome detail, made a frickin' infomercial or something, but constantly tiptoeing around the prominent themes of homelessness and poverty like this feels grossly disingenuous. Oliver and Company refuses any kind of insight on the subject. In fact, it just goes hard in the opposite direction, as the band of dogs climb up on a garbage truck to wallow in the trash and sing confidently about a life of no worries, as the camera pans out on the exact same establishing shot of New York City we started on, really hammering home how the status quo remains unbroken, that nothing substantial has actually changed. The rich people are still rich and the poor people are still poor. The natural order of America is restored. There is no profound conclusion about real-life homelessness, despite the story using a contemporary setting to create strong associations to the audience's own reality. The movie wants you to believe that these characters aren't really miserable. In fact, they're singing and dancing about this romantic, carefree life they live on the streets. Why should you worry, Dodger? Why should you care? Well, we've actually got plenty of reasons why you should worry and care about being homeless. We even made a list. Admittedly, we do not know a lot about Fagin's predicaments. We do not know how he got into his current situation, what he did before that, or what made him desperate enough to take a loan from the final boss of Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. But based on what we see in the movie, he is definitely a troubled individual. He's put under a lot of stress and has trouble getting enough food for himself. The guy lives in a boat wreck with too many animals, some of which hate to bathe. He might have a gambling issue, and to suspect that he has mental health problems is not far-fetched. He at least definitely has some kind of trauma going on right about now. Will these things be magically resolved because Nanomachine Sun exploded into smithereens? I mean, probably not, right? Yes, this is a goofy cartoon world where animals are as clever as humans, but we also need to remember that it is in fact an obvious reflection of our world, one where poverty and death is clearly a reality. Clearly. And that's the thing with poverty and homelessness. It sort of perpetuates itself. Problems stack on top of each other. If you happen to be in these situations for whatever reason, the circumstances for which you found yourself in them are likely to exacerbate themselves. Being forced to the streets for any medical reason, physical or mental, that prevent you from working, for example, are not going to improve by being under such pressures. Just living in a substandard shelter like Fagin does could be considered a serious, probably even dangerous health condition. And there is no reason for us as viewers to truly believe that he will make it out of that situation. He has no prospects and a myriad of more problems still looming over him. One down, a shit ton more to go. even if we acknowledge that this is a Disney movie for kids, a mostly harmless one with a lot of colorful characters and fun scenes, it is hard for us as adults to look at it without being reminded about the absolutely real troubles it depicts. At the time, it was as contemporary as one can be, taking place in factual-ass New York City, the same year as its cinema debut, with characters facing relevant issues of the day. But even though it's more than 30 years old at this point, it is not that far removed from our society of today either. The issues depicted in the movie might actually be even more tangible now with lots of hindsight and scrutiny. The silly, unfortunate street man and his wacky dogs with no worries just don't ring true when considering the real-life implications of today, or at the time for that matter. I mean, just consider this. According to the Coalition for the Homeless, by the end of 1988, when this film was released and set, 25,751 people slept in New York City shelters each night. And that's not even counting whoever was instead sleeping on the streets. Or in a boat wreck, if you will. Even more alarming, over a third of these people were children, who might have even wanted to go see Oliver and Company in theaters. Heck, some of them probably even did one way or another. And that visual image is not just heartbreaking and depressing, it's downright disgusting. And hey, if you thought those numbers were bad, it gets worse. Growing up basically makes it easy to understand that Fagin was not alone in his plight, and that even by the end of the movie when he befriends the good millionaire's daughter, there is no solution in sight. At least not one that is presented by the movie itself. Jenny's parents clearly won't humor him, considering the butler wants the guests gone the moment he hears that the real people are coming home. So for Fagin, it's just back to wallowing in the trash of his own misery that will most likely get even worse considering the difficult situation he lives in. The carefree characters, the happy upbeat music, and the overall jovial presentation comes off as a ridiculous facade that just faintly tries to cover up the fact that things are quite a bit more shit than they are making them out to be. But if there was one thing Oliver and Company truly did right, it was to portray this issue in such a tone-deaf way that it inevitably made us question its intentions, to sort of force us to disregard its message and actually think about the real-life equivalents ourselves. Now, you might think that we must truly hate this movie, but I can't say we really do. There are a few pieces of media we'd be willing to say that we hate, while talking about them for however long this video is. There is not much reason to actually hate a movie like Oliver and Company, to be quite honest. It has never been relevant, and the worst crime it ever committed in most people's eyes was probably being a bit mediocre for a Disney flick.
And I mean, we probably consumed more Oliver and Company material than anyone else has ever done, just to make sure we didn't miss anything. We read the book for toddlers and the graphic novel. We listened to the storybook and soundtrack on vinyl. We even played the goddamn board game. That is to say, for us to talk about a piece of media and analyze it like this means that we at least found it interesting enough to give the time of day. In fact, we probably enjoy this film more than most people for the simple reason that we got something out of it. Something to think about.
We do, however, still quite firmly believe that it is a bit shitty and mean when it comes to the portrayal of real-life issues that affect a lot of people, not only in New York, but all over the world, who, luckily for Disney, probably won't see the movie to comment on it. Ultimately, the most important messages one may discover in Oliver and Company are the ones that aren't really there at all. It's rather the stuff they completely ignored or left out in their careless striving for the next Disney hit.
You can't solve poverty by killing the final bad guy like in a video game. And ironically enough, Oliver and Company does indeed reveal that in its nonchalant ending scene. The status quo, the class divides, and the neglect of the systems that put our characters in their positions are on full display without explicitly being stated. And for that, Disney should most likely go suck on an egg or something. At the very least, you shouldn't give them your money to see this trashfire film. Instead, we're gonna link some charity organizations that support homeless people down below and ask you to donate. Because screw Oliver and his goddamn company. It's time to worry and care. Welcome to the end card. We're glad you could make it here. We would like to thank our guest voice this time, Dropinion Dump. She makes a lot of neat video essays that we think you will like. So we have put some links in the description so you can find her there. Go check her out, she's really cool. Thank you. And of course, as usual, we would like to thank our Patreon supporters because they make all of this possible. So, let's go. Andrew Jones, Luke, All Purpose Nobody, Afayette, Ben Clark, Bibi the Bitch, Cult of Diana, Ember, Emrasa, Gage McColgan, Joel Nilsson, Klaus Morals, Matthias Graman, Meowmix64, Mosling, Nate Kiernan, Nishvet, Raider of the Stars, TB Skyen, Abigail Nail, Amanda Rönne Idenge, Andreas, Baskelin, Billy Moran, Blumenberg Ultra, Butch Fivar, Charles Goldhaber, Chloe, Chloe Strange, Eli Berg Moss, Ephemeral Mist, Floofquist, Frankie Teardrop, Indigo Trance, Leinen, Marika, Marb, Max Miller, Mitch Haley, Nathan Schaff, Never Haunting You, Rivokas Magma, Scott from Nerdsync, Silly Rookie, Skyharpers, Sweet Pink, Sylva Rigota, Tobias Mattsson, VG, Whimsim, and C33. If you want to support us as well, you can do so on patreon.com/transparens. There is a link right here on the screen now. And again, thank you for watching. Bye!